mon collègue et ami. Oui, alors on recommence. Je veux juste vous présenter mon collègue et ami Frédéric Méran, qui est non seulement un sociologue qui enseigne en sciences politiques. So my friend and colleague Frédéric Méran is not only a political scientist who works in sociology, but he's really one of the he's running one of the most fascinating academic center in Montreal, and he's not from my university, so I usually do not do publicity for other university, but Frédéric Méran is running the Serium at the University of Montreal, which is really a master place for intellectual commitment, intellectual talk and discussion in Montreal. So if you want to follow him and get in touch with maybe with Frédéric after, the events that are proposed online by the Serium are always of very great quality. Alors Frédéric, je te laisse la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Frédéric Guillaume. C'est une introduction très gentille. C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous pour, je crois, le dernier panel de la journée, sauf erreur, qui s'intitule « Le populisme en Amérique du Nord ». Si vous le voulez bien, je vais passer à l'anglais puisque je crois que ce sera la langue dans laquelle vont intervenir tous nos intervenants et nos intervenantes cet après-midi. Alors, je ne vais pas faire de présentation biographique puisque je m'attends à ce que ce soit sur le site web. So we have 3 papers about populism in North America. Elke Winter, Anke Patzelt, und Verena Schmid, who will present a really interesting piece comparing Canada and Germany. That will be followed by Chad Goldberg, who will talk about Wisconsin. Very, very relevant right now. And final paper by Jan Doering and F.A. Peker on the secularism or laïcité in Quebec. So not necessarily my field of expertise, but I think I'll have some things to say about that. So I'll reserve my comments and reactions for the end. I think you must be used to the routine. So each group of presenters has 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So we'll start with Elke, Anke, and Verena.
Okay, and I'm just gonna look at Verena and Anke, who will be doing the presentation.
Perfect. Could you just allow me to share my screen for the presentation?
Anke, I just did.
Okay, let's see. Yep, perfect. Thank you. Wonderful. So thank you so much for sticking around for the last panel of today. So I'll just jump right into it and give you a brief introduction and background to our research. Essentially for a few years now, but specifically since the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, many Western European countries and Northern American countries, among others, have experienced a polarization of their society regarding the reception and integration of migrants and refugees. And so these societies and countries have specifically experienced an anti-immigrant backlash and the rise of populism. So both populist movements and the rise of populist parties. But on the other hand, they've also experienced what's called welcome culture, so a surge of willingness of civil society actors to help with the reception and integration of refugees. And Germany is a particularly prominent example of this polarization. So on the one hand, in 2015, Germany got international recognition for Angela Merkel's sentence of "We can do it, wir schaffen das," and it's Willkommenskultur, so welcome culture. But on the other hand, at the same time, Germany also experienced a rise in right-wing movements, such as Pegida, or right-wing parties such as the Alternative for Germany. Canada, on the other hand, seems to be a bit of a counterexample to this polarization. As in 2015, Justin Trudeau was elected president by placing himself against divisive ethnic politics, such as the prohibition of, so he opposed the prohibition of wearing the hijab at citizenship ceremonies, which the conservative government wanted to push through, and also promised to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees to Canada. So within this context of polarized societies and the debates and events around this, we're kind of examining public claims making in the Rhine-Neckar metropolitan region in Germany and the French and English bilingual national capital region in Canada. And specifically, we explore the following questions. So what are the dominant claims voiced for or against the reception and integration of migrants and refugees? And how can these claims be interpreted as acts of citizenship, so that is lived participation within the polity, and what conclusions can be made about the polarization of the two societies with regard to the reception and integration of refugees? And in exploring these questions, we're placing them within the theoretical framework of an agency-oriented approach of citizenship, which is inspired by such authors as Koopmans et al., Isen and Nielsen, or Blumrad, among others, who see claims making as acts of citizenship or as an expression of citizenship. So as already mentioned, we focus on the local level and make a comparison between the region around Heidelberg in Germany and the national capital region in Canada. And the reasons why we focus on the local level are that, well, overall, the integration and reception of refugees takes predominantly place on the local level. So it's cities and regions that are having to deal with the arrival of refugees and welcoming them into their societies. But also because research has shown that local newspapers tend to report differently about issues related to refugees. And finally, also, there has been research done with regard to Germany and Canada on the media representation of refugees, but this research mainly focuses on the national level and does not pay any attention to the local level. And then in addition to that, we also found that in research, or that research has demonstrated that actions on the local level with regard to the reception and integration of refugees are often more targeted to finding pragmatic solutions. They are more liberal than those that can be found on a national level. And often more motivated by humanitarian reasons rather than political ones. So in terms of methodology, we explored claims that were made on behalf of, against, and by refugees in 3 regional newspapers. So on the one hand, we had the Rhine-Neckar Zeitung in Germany, and then for the Canadian case study, we looked at the Ottawa Citizen and Les Droits. We specifically focused on the time frame between September 2015 and January 2016. And in total, we retrieved 227 articles that contain claims in Germany, and then 226 from the Canadian newspapers. Overall, we analyzed these claims that we found in the articles in a 2-step analysis. So first, we implemented a coding scheme that was inspired by Koopmans et al. And then after that, we analyzed the claims that we found more specifically with the phenomenon structure of the sociology of knowledge approach to discourse that's developed by Keller. And just to very briefly give you a definition of what we actually mean by claims when we talk about that. So to qualify as an instance of claims making, the text must include a reference to an ongoing or concluded physical or verbal action in the public sphere. So that means that articles that refer simply to attributions of attitudes or opinions of actors by the media are not included in the claims we are making. So if, for example, an article would say the Greens who want to extend recognition to people persecuted by non-state organizations, this would not qualify as an instance of claims making. Whereas if the sentence was the Greens who said they wanted to extend recognition to people persecuted by non-state organizations, this would qualify as there is an active verb that's used to proclaim this claim. So yeah, just to give you a brief idea of what we actually mean by claims making. And then now I pass it on to Verena.
So thank you, Anke. Yeah, after a long process of newspaper analysis and the search for and structuring of claims, we found three dominant narratives that in Germany and in Canada. Of course, there are some specialities in each country, but today we want to focus on the similarities. The first narration is settlement and ordered reception of refugee. This narration focuses on regulation. It is being discussed primarily at the national level in both countries and by politicians. The second narration deals with the local challenge of refugee reception, and it's about pragmatic action on the local level by civil society actors. And the third one is welcoming refugee, and it's concentrated on values, culture, and obligation of the country or group to accommodate and integrate refugees. All actors, whether local or national, participate in this discourse or narration. Today, we want to focus on the first two in order to better illustrate our finding on polarization and populism by contrasting the local and national narration out of the local perspective. Therefore, we brought some examples with us. So next slide, please. Perfect. So the German narration, opening, closing borders, or about the ordered reception was at least started at the beginning of September 2015 in Germany, when Germany opened its border for refugees from Hungary. And after the opening, some days of uncontrolled immigration started in Europe. And because of this, countries like Austria or Denmark stopped train traffic, and Hungary even built a wall. In Germany, the opening of the borders were often seen as a personal mistake of Angela Merkel. Like this claim shows, it's a clear demand with which Horst Seehofer will go to the refugee summit in Berlin this evening. Chancellor Angela Merkel must state quite clearly how she intends to stop the influx of refugees, as EU leader claims. The Christian socialists are blaming the chancellor, reacting with head-shaking, mockery, and incomprehension to the weekend's decision to open the border for refugees from Hungary, a disastrous signal. The CSU leaders claimed for an upper limit of refugee reception, and the dispute between Merkel from the CDU and Seehofer from the CSU started around the question of the capacity of Germany for taking refugees in. Politicians from different parties, not only from Merkel's one, supported and other ones supported Seehofer. But the whole time Merkel defended the decision, we can do this. No one said we can do this overnight. So the leading question of this time was, how can we get control over the borders and how can we regulate the immigration? Especially the discussion about the upper limit shows the importance of numbers and organized procedure in this narration.
Okay, in Canada, we found very similar claims related to those questions of regulating the immigration, how many numbers can enter Canada, and so forth. So specifically, we identified three different discourses or narratives in these claims on the settlement and ordered reception. So the first claims were related to a criticism of the conservative government's refugee strategy. And so these were obviously, or these claims relate to the time during the election campaign in 2015, and those claims were mainly made by politicians of the opposition parties, which demanded that the former Prime Minister Harper should allow more refugees to enter, and also claimed that he was making negative connotations between refugees and national security, among other. Then we also identified a discussion around the numbers of refugees who should be allowed to enter, and specifically that was during the election campaign again, where the three leaders of the main three parties in Canada, so the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Liberals, kind of tried to outnumber each other. So there were claims relating to Justin Trudeau stating that Canada should take in 25,000 refugees, whereas the other two parties had around 10,000 refugees they wanted to bring to Canada. And then lastly, and related to this number game kind of in these claims, there were the questions or claims related to the category of desired refugee groups. And within these claims, which can be seen both within or both from the Harper period and entering into the Trudeau government as well, are statements and claims related to the fact that those who are most vulnerable should be resettled to Canada, and those most vulnerable were identified as women, children, and members of religious or ethnic minority groups, as well as LGBTQ+, or people belonging to the LGBTQ+ community. Whereas on the other hand, single male refugees should be excluded or were excluded by the government policies. And there were claims relating to the potential security risk that these single male refugees could pose to Canada, especially after the attacks in Paris in October 2015, when there were increasingly claims for more security controls relating to the resettlement of Syrian refugees to Canada.
The local level, in contrast to the national level, which is much about numbers and counting, is dealt with really practical challenges. There were not enough equipped accommodation, not enough furniture, not enough strollers or school places with language classes. Therefore, pragmatic solutions had to be found. Claims of these narrations, often claims for pragmatic help in the process of initial reception, like the claim was the search for accommodation. With about 300 individuals arriving per week, which we then have to distribute to our accommodation, we need such a facility like an emergency accommodation for a kind of initial reception. And the local communities hoped and claimed also for support of the state to reduce the burden on federal, state, and local authorities, or to pay Finance Minister Schäuble well over 3 billion euros, holistically, permanent, and structural. So the strength of the local community was not financing or number, but the ability to take a pragmatic approach to solve or deal with this local challenge.
In the national, or in the newspapers in the national capital region, we found again similar claims that pertain to the housing and finding temporary accommodations for refugees upon their arrival, but also ensuring that the necessary services, so for example medical and psychological resources, were close by to ensure a quick and unproblematic integration of the newcomers. And so specifically, there were claims relating on the one hand, to the enormous surge of willingness of civil society actors and the Canadian population in general to help with the situation. So, for example, by volunteering, offering housing, donating money, or other things to help with the reception and arrival of the newcomers to Canada. And here we see that claims are not so much expressed in a verbal form, but rather through actions such as volunteering or donating different items, for example. At the same time, we also found claims that were made by NGOs or schools, for example, which stated that they would help to provide certain services, such as French classes, to help with the integration of refugees in the specific areas of and also that they were prepared for, or stated that they were prepared and ready for the arrival. And so, in addition to in contrast to the German cases, we here also found not only questions around housing, but also more specifically around integration, which can partly be explained by the fact that refugees or resettled refugees in Canada arrive with the status of being permanent residents already, and so they need to be, their long-term integration into society needs to be ensured.
Okay, to conclude, our results show that it is important to divide. Into two broader streams. On the one hand, we've got the national political level from a local perspective, and on the other hand, the local level with civil society actors. Only at the national political level, we see tendencies of polarization that were reported on the local press. This polarization takes place around the question of controlling, organizing numbers, and so on, to the arrival and reception of refugees. As we all know, there are politicians who argue both for refugees, and there are some arguing against refugees. So in general, it's a really verbal debate that struggles for a compromise, but they can't find a real compromise because of this polarized camps. Through searching for compromise, they negotiate citizenship by determining how, who, how many, and based on which criteria refugees may enter the country. Second, the local level, claims made by civil society actors that relate to the local level focus on concrete action to help refugees. So they try to find pragmatic solution to get the situation managed. There's no time for labeling debates or something like this. And the help at the local level is characterized by a cosmopolitan and moral understanding of citizenship. Everyone has the right to have rights. So they negotiate citizenship by applying a moral and humanitarian point of view. By focusing on the dimension of action and on pragmatic solution, the local level tries to avoid this verbally polarized debate and create facts on the ground through their action. So that's a practical act of citizenship. But the described attitudes at the national and local level both didn't change the status quo a lot. Canada still is a country of immigration, and Germany a country excluding foreigners. But that I want to say at the end is that our findings that there's no polarization at the local level can't be generalized to Germany and Canada at all, because the results, of course, influenced by the choice of the region. Heidelberg didn't receive any major backlash against refugees like we've seen in Dresden. And the National Capital Region, as well has a long history of helping refugees in need, and it's politically more liberal. So it would be very interesting to compare our results to other regions in Canada and Germany. Yeah, and so I want to say thank you for listening. For me, so late. For you, maybe not. Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you, Anke, Verena, and Elke. And I now turn the floor to Chad Goldberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Frédéric. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. Good afternoon or good evening, good night, depending on where you are. I'm looking forward to Frédéric's comments and a broader discussion. This paper is a work in progress, so what you will have to say will be very helpful to me today. I'm going to try to share my screen, if I may. I just have a couple of slides that I want to share, but let me see if I can do that. Okay. My browser is not allowing me to do that, so I will have to proceed without them.
Chad, I actually just made you co-host, so if you try it should be able to allow you.
Okay, let me try that. And yeah, thank you, but it's still not working. I think the problem is on my end. It's the browser that I'm using for some reason. It's preventing me from sharing the slides. It's okay. It's a table that I wanted to share, but we'll work around it. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe you can send it directly to one of us, Efe, me, or Guillaume, and we can project it.
Yeah, let me try that, if you don't mind waiting just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Give me just a second. Okay. Several of you should get it now, so maybe one of you can put it up on the screen.
Chad, was it sent through email?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know.
I sent it to the Colloque Populisme Gmail account, but also to the panelists.
Indeed, you did. As far as I'm concerned, I cannot share my screen because I'm not the co-host.
Maybe Anke can. Anke, can you check your email because we got it?
I actually got it.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'll be sharing my screen.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Open the document.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, no problem.
Sorry for the technical problems.
Okay, I think got it.
Yeah, there it is. Okay. And if you don't mind, yeah, that's the slide. Basically, I wanted to start there just so people who have no idea where Wisconsin is, which might be a fair number of people, that allows you to locate it on the map. Okay, so let me get started. While studies of contemporary right-wing populism draw attention to the educational divide that underlies it, they do not adequately theorize the changing relationships of the highly educated to other social classes and their accounts of this phenomenon. That's what this paper aims to do. There's a long line of theorizing that identifies the highly educated as a new class pursuing their own power and privilege while pretending to represent universal interests. In this paper, I argue that there are important points at which Pierre Bourdieu's field theory converges with new class theories, and that the resulting insights can shed new light on contemporary right-wing populism. And I illustrate these arguments with a case study of political developments in the state of Wisconsin. Let me begin with the theoretical framework. Bourdieu's field theory provides a better basis for understanding social struggles than dualistic divisions of the social world, whether Marxist or populist, that oversimplify the complex, multidimensional ways in which social agents are stratified. For Bourdieu, a social class is, in the first place, a set of agents who occupy similar positions in what he calls the field of social classes, or more simply, social space. He conceives this social space in three dimensions: the volume of capital that agents possess, the composition of agents' capital holdings, and changes in the volume and composition of capital over time. Differences in the volume of capital divide the dominant from the dominated classes. However, differences in the composition of capital create an equally important division between, on the one hand, the dominant fraction of the dominant class, whose economic wealth exceeds their cultural capital, and on the other hand, the dominated fraction of the dominant class, what others have called the new class, which is richer in cultural capital than in economic capital. This multidimensional conception of social space gives Bourdieu a cogent way to explain political alliances between intellectuals and the dominated classes. What makes these alliances possible is not proximate social positions or similar conditions of existence, but rather a resemblance between different relationships. In Bourdieu's words, the homology of position between intellectuals and industrial workers, the former occupying within the field of power, that is, vis-a-vis the captains of industry and commerce, positions which are homologous to those occupied by industrial workers in the social space as a whole, is the source of an ambiguous alliance, unquote. So one implication is that intellectuals cannot wield power without allies among the dominated classes. Bourdieu's field theory identifies the structural basis that makes such an alliance possible, and at the same time renders it precarious and vulnerable to being undone. Bourdieu suggests that the dominated classes need intellectuals, no less than intellectuals need allies among the dominated classes. Symbolic work is necessary to transform a class on paper into a real mobilized class, and the unequal distribution of cultural capital ensures that not everyone is equally capable of performing this work. Therefore, Bourdieu argues the dominated classes can only be collectively mobilized if they delegate to others the authority to define the group's identity and interests, to speak for it, and thus to make the group. These spokesmen are typically intellectuals drawn from the ranks of the new class, who can, by virtue of this role, impose their own interests as the interests of those whom they represent. This danger is mitigated when intellectuals develop an interest in disinterestedness. Fields may be structured in such a way that the agents within them can only satisfy their particular interests when they contribute to producing the universal. To the degree that the scientific field is autonomous, it's a case in point. Scientists, like other social agents, engage in struggles for domination, but they must use reason to prevail within their field. Bourdieu also finds an interest in the universal within the bureaucratic and juridical fields. He argues that, quote, the new class, the power and authority of which rests on the new cultural capital, has to elevate its particular interests to a superior degree of universalization and invent a version of the ideology of public service and of meritocracy in order to prevail in its struggles with the other dominant fractions, unquote. So that's the theoretical framework. Now, consider how these insights apply to Wisconsin, which developed a national reputation as a laboratory for progressive social and political reform in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. This is during the period that the sociologist Alvin Goldner identified as the takeoff period for the new class in the United States. And the efflorescence of reform in those years grew out of a partnership between the state university and the state government in Wisconsin. But in Wisconsin, new class actors expressed their power aspirations in a democratic key, viewing themselves as a service elite rather than a ruling elite. Charles McCarthy, a University of Wisconsin graduate and civil servant, lent these aspirations a name with the title of his 1912 book, The Wisconsin Idea. The Wisconsin Idea referred to all of the ameliorative activities of the Wisconsin progressive movement, including those of the university. Reformers used this idea to mobilize social classes and forge new alliances among them in early 20th century Wisconsin. Now, to become effective forces in history, ideas need social carriers. In the early 20th century, the Wisconsin idea was promoted by a reformist coalition that included, first of all, university professors and administrators. Second, dedicated and innovative civil servants led by McCarthy. Third, political advocates of a cooperative commonwealth, most notably urban socialists in Milwaukee and militant farm organizations. And fourth and finally, a group of progressive Republican politicians. What is most noteworthy for our purposes is that this coalition brought members of the dominated classes, at that time and in that context, workers and farmers, together with new class actors. Also important were the three institutional pillars on which the Wisconsin idea rested, all of which empowered expert knowledge. Those pillars were the University of Wisconsin, the legislative McCarthy established in 1901, and several quasi-independent administrative commissions created between 1899 and 1914 to provide nonpartisan scientific expert regulation. These were the structural positions from which the advocates of the Wisconsin idea sought to realize their vision. While political counterforces hostile to the Wisconsin idea came to power as early as the state's 1914 gubernatorial election and have reemerged periodically since then, the administration of Republican Governor Scott Walker from 2011 to 2019 brought what may be the most radical challenge to the Wisconsin idea yet. The nationwide wave of Republican victories and the 2010 midterm elections in the United States gave the party control of the governor's office and both houses of the state legislature in Wisconsin. With a conservative majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court since 2008, the state was effectively under one-party rule. Under Walker's leadership, Republicans used these gains to cement their political power and systematically dismantle the historic achievements of Wisconsin progressivism. As Dan Kaufman puts it, quote, Wisconsin's century-old progressive legacy has been dismantled in virtually every area: labor rights, environmental protection, voting rights, and government transparency, unquote. Now, the ties between dominant economic groups and the Republican-controlled state government were not hard to document. Nor do we need esoteric knowledge of Marxist theory to understand how the policies instituted by Wisconsin Republicans in the past decade benefited the dominant fraction of the dominant class. That work has been done by others, and I won't spend time doing it here. What is perhaps less widely appreciated is how the Walker agenda targeted the interest of the new class. To begin with, Walker and the Republican-controlled legislature undermined the three institutional pillars on which the Wisconsin idea historically rested. Legislation enacted in 2015 defunded the University of Wisconsin system, enabled politically appointed regents to weaken tenure, and vitiated the sharing of university governance with students, academic staff, and faculty. Legislation that Walker signed in 2016 weakened Wisconsin's civil service system, replacing civil service exams with resumes judged by the governor's political appointees, centralizing hiring within one of the most politicized agencies in the state government, and making it easier to fire civil servants without proving just cause. The Republican-controlled legislature also took aim at independent commissions, outright eliminating, for example, the state's nonpartisan Government Accountability Board. In addition to undermining the structural positions from which new class actors historically exercised political influence in the state, these changes weakened the autonomy of the cultural and bureaucratic fields. And lastly, the targeting of the new class was apparent in efforts to devalue cultural capital, at least in the objectified form of educational credentials. Among other examples that I give in the paper, I describe how Republicans repeatedly tried to weaken educational credential requirements for public school teachers. So we might ask, how was this conservative revolution possible? If the Wisconsin idea at the beginning of the 20th century reflected political alliance of the emerging new class of highly educated professionals with workers and farmers against what McCarthy called predatory wealth, I argue that the dismantling of the Wisconsin idea 100 years later reflects a top-bottom political alliance between economic capital and those classes with little capital of any kind against the new class, the bearers of cultural capital, who have always been the main social carriers of the Wisconsin idea. The best evidence for this interpretation comes from an analysis of the state's 72 counties by voting patterns, median household income, and educational attainment. And if you could advance to the next slide, people can take a look at that table. So I don't have time to discuss this analysis in detail, but what I want to emphasize here, the main takeaway is that political support for Scott Walker, the governor from 2011 to 2019, roughly corresponded to the unequal distribution of the different kinds of capital and geographical space. So the counties most likely to support Walker consistently were counties that were categorized as having high household incomes, but also relatively low levels of educational attainment, and also those counties that were categorized as having low household incomes and relatively low levels of educational attainment. So it's both the high income, low education counties and the low income, low education counties. So I would argue that these findings are consistent with the thesis that in Wisconsin over the past decade, the dominant fraction of the dominant class has allied with a sizable portion of the dominated classes against the new class. And I can talk more about this table in the Q&A if people are interested. Now, this top-bottom alliance was constructed through the symbolic work of populism, of a kind of right-wing populism. Americans have long used the language of populism to mobilize the people against elites, but these terms, of course, don't have fixed reference. Beginning in the late 1940s, rightist groups and politicians appropriated and creatively adapted populist language in the United States. While retaining the term special interests, they no longer used that term to designate monopolies and big corporations. Instead, they attacked federal judges and bureaucrats, academics, and the media as a new type of elite. And Scott Walker's brand of blue-collar conservative populism was really cut from the same cloth. Political scientist Catherine J. Kramer has provided perhaps the best analysis of the politics of resentment that brought Walker to power for nearly a decade kept him in power in Wisconsin. She found that voters in rural and small town Wisconsin perceived themselves as dominated, they resented it, and they expressed their resentment geographically in antipathy toward the state's two largest cities, Milwaukee and Madison. Moreover, rural and small town residents typically mapped this urban-rural division onto the public-private division. They tended to equate rural residents with hard work, the private sector, and deservingness, while they equated urbanites with laziness, public employment, and undeservingness. As Bourdieu points out, a number of the differences which are usually associated with the effect of geographical space are the effect of distance and social space, which is to say, of the unequal distribution of the different kinds of capital and geographical space. Along these lines, I suggest that the unequal distribution of economic and cultural capital in geographical space provides a real basis for the resentment of rural communities. This is also the case with resentments of public employees. A 2011 study found that state employees in Wisconsin were better educated than private sector workers. Consequently, state employees' total compensation was slightly higher on average than that of private employees. The animosity to public employees then, like the animosity to cities, was at bottom animosity to the concentration of economic and especially cultural capital. While not every public employee can plausibly be regarded as a member of the new class, a substantial portion of the new class is publicly employed. I have argued that populism provided the symbolic work necessary to forge a top-bottom political alliance between the dominant fraction of the dominant class and the dominated classes. But what, if any, structural basis is there for this alliance? From the perspective of Bourdieu's field theory, it appears surprising and puzzling because these groups occupy neither proximate nor homologous positions in social space. I suggest that there is, nevertheless, a structural basis for this alliance, albeit different from the structural basis on which the earlier alliance of intellectuals and the dominated classes rested. As Max Weber recognized, the members of the new class monopolize socially and economically advantageous positions on the basis of their educational credentials. the sociologist Frank Parkin described this as an exclusionary type of social closure, or in his words, the use of power in a downward fashion and downward direction in which the highly educated secure their advantages at the expense of groups who lack educational credentials. However, insofar as credentialism prioritizes cultural over economic capital, the new class is simultaneously engaged in what Parkin called a usurpationary type of social closure. That is, the use of power in an upward direction to bite into the privileges of the dominant class fraction whose economic wealth exceeds their cultural capital. To the extent that members of the new class improve their social positions by means of closure against the dominated classes and the dominant class fraction, these groups stand in a structurally similar relationship to the new class and share an interest in resisting its closure efforts. This, I would argue, is the structural basis for what Kramer calls the politics of resentment. The key to this kind of politics is the opportunity it affords the dominated for vicarious domination. A top-bottom political alliance is not primarily based on the expectation of the dominated that they will gain from it, but rather on the satisfaction they derive from dispossessing others perceived to be living better at their expense. A top-bottom political alliance thus allows the dominated to exercise domination vicariously through the actions of their representative over others. To conclude, field theory offers a cogent explanation for political alliances between intellectuals and the dominated classes. However, such alliances were historically specific and contingent. To treat them as a universal and invariant feature of democratic politics would blind us to the breakdown of this kind of alliance today and the construction of a different alliance in the field of social classes. The task for historical sociology is not to deduce from field theory the persistence, despite all evidence to the contrary, of what we might call the classic alliance described by Bourdieu, but rather to use field theory to explain the new alliance that is taking its place. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. Now the last presentation by Jan and Efe. Efe is doing everything at the same time in this panel, I think.
Efe, thank you for getting my slides up and allowing other people to see this.
Oh, no worries, Chad. I'm glad it worked out.
Frédéric, Efe is always doing everything at the same time.
Okay, I'm hoping this is visible to everyone. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So this is the last presentation of today and of the conference of the Colloquium. Our title is Reactive or Diminished Ethnicity, an analysis of Muslims' responses to secularist legislative actions in Quebec. So this project is carried out by Jan Doering at McGill University, whom I met when I was doing my postdoc, which I completed last year. And we continued the project together. And as the title suggests, our main interest is to ask the question, how do target populations or populations that are targeted by populist and nativist exclusionary discourses react to such characterizations or such framing of their ethnic or religious or ethno-religious identities? To give you a brief introduction, also I should add that I'm presenting this now, but Jan is here with us and we'll be happy to answer the questions together. Since the 2000s in the West, there's been a series of laws in the Western democracies restricting the display of religious signs in public spaces and or for persons in public in certain roles. One can think of the 2004 law and 2010 law in France on religious signs, Germany's regional bans on religious signs for teachers, and face covering laws in 5 European Union countries, starting with France and then Belgium, Bulgaria, Austria, and Denmark, and recently the Netherlands, and so on. So these kind of restrictions have had strong support of right-wing populist groups. Although they may not be in power, they've been successful in influencing mainstream or traditionally mainstream parties to take such positions. And the reality is that Islam and Muslims have been at the center of these public debates. Let's think back to what happened in Quebec. In the early 2000s, it was a combination of Muslims and also the Sikh with the Kirpan affair, and also the Orthodox Jewish in Montreal in particular, that were part of the reasonable accommodation debates. But 10 years, 15 years later, it's mostly the Muslims that these discourses target. So what we're interested in is the following question: how do such laws restricting the expression of ethno-religious identities and also the public debates revolving around those laws influence the salience of ethno-religious identities among minority residents? And more specifically, does it cause reactive or diminished ethnicity? I'll explain what those mean in more detail, but reactive ethnicity refers to being more strongly attached to one's ethnic identity based on perceived discrimination. And diminished ethnicity would be to hide them as much as possible. And so the question is there an increase or decrease in ethnic self-identification, solidarity, and mobilization? Focusing on the case of Quebec, what we'll do is I'll focus on the literature on reactive and diminished ethnicity briefly. I'll introduce the Quebec context for those who may not be familiar with the province. I'll talk about our methods and data, and then share the findings, and then the implications of the research. So what does the literature on reactive ethnicity say? This can be found in the sociology of migration, ethnicity, and social movements. And as you can see in that definition over there, it's kind of an identity formation. It's a kind of identity formation that occurs in the face of perceived threats, persecution, discrimination, and exclusion. And the concept have been used to study Latinx communities in the United States, Turks in Germany, Moroccans in the Netherlands, and other Muslims in Europe and North America. And it entails ethnic self-identification at the individual level, and also solidarity with the larger community, and also actively taking part in politics, or a combination thereof. There are different interpretations and debates on this in the literature, which I'll move forward, which I'll pass at the moment, but we can come back to that. But one thing that we've noticed is that there's not enough focus on micro-sociological processes. So what happens at the individual and small group level when faced with these kind of perceived discrimination is not studied very commonly, which we hope to address. How about diminished ethnicity? So this is basically the opposite of reactive ethnicity. It's, to our knowledge, it's not really conceptualized as a term, diminished ethnicity, but it can be found in various places and sometimes in political arguments. So instead of resulting in activism, in this case, perceived discrimination leads to lower degree of ethnic self-identification, solidarity, and mobilization. And it did gain salience as an intended outcome for minorities, especially France and Quebec. In France, the justification for the 2004 and 10 laws after the Islamic veil affair, and in Quebec, the reasonable accommodation and laïcité debates. Just to give you two examples, the one underneath is from the right at the beginning of the l'affaire du voile islamique, the Islamic veil affair in France. The famous newspaper article in the Le Nouvel Observateur by the authors you can see over there. Students must have the pleasure of forgetting their home community and thinking of something other than what they are in order to be able to think for themselves. So this is an intended outcome for removing the headscarf by so diminishing their ethnic identity and becoming themselves. One other example from Quebec is defines laïcité. A Republican project centered on laïcité presents a better potential for social cohesion than multiculturalism. Of course, the famous contrast between Québécois laïcité and Canadian multiculturalism, which I won't go into now, but which tend to reinforce the cultural and religious identities of each subgroup. So although this is not recognized in the literature, particularly diminished ethnicity, it is openly or more discreetly mentioned as an intended outcome for policies restricting religious identities. So the context of Quebec briefly, 8 million plus population and roughly a quarter of Canada and 80% Francophone. And as you know, a very complicated relationship with religion since the Quiet Revolution. And there's a general religious skepticism based on that. Does it have elements of Catholicité, as we spoke this morning? That's of course debatable. And Muslims constitute 3 to 4% of the population. And according to research by Wilkins, Daflam, and some others, there's a lower positive attitudes towards Muslims than the rest of Canada. So this is from the perspective of Muslims in Quebec. And what we're interested in, as these different, since 2008 or 6 or 8, basically, the reasonable accommodation debates have been going on. How did Muslims register these developments? And also how did they shape their identities or modulate their identities based on these debates? Just to remind you of what happened with those pictures, the Bouchard-Taylor report of 2008, after 2 years of, at least, of reasonable accommodation debates. And then we have Pauline Marois, Bernard Tranville, the Charte des Valeurs Québécoises. And then 2017, the Religious Neutrality Law, Minister of Justice Stéphanie Vallée. And finally, 2019, Coalition d'Avenir Québec's Bill 21, Loi sur la laïcité de l'État, and with Simon Jorin-Barrette and François Legaudin. So as you know, it banned religious signs for public employees in positions of authority. So what we're interested in is to see how these were registered, as I said. What we did was we carried out 31 in-depth biographical interviews with 24 Muslims in the Montreal metropolitan area. It was based on snowball sampling, and it included a diversity of groups, first and second generation immigrants with different levels of religiosity. We'll see in a second that one of them declares himself to be fully atheist, but still clinging to or hanging on to the Muslim identity. And we also carried out interviews with political party representatives from Parti Québécois, Parti libéral du Québec, and Québec solidaire. Sadly, we couldn't get anyone to talk to us from La Coalition d'Avenir Québec, but hopefully in the future. And it also included approximately 50 hours of participant observation. This includes protests and marches, debates, events organized by Muslims, and so on, and analysis of media discourse. So based on this available data, we classified via open coding, and we developed hermeneutic portraits of the people, the 24 people that we've studied. And here are some of the results that we found. The first finding is related to reactive ethnicity. 11, based on the hermeneutic portraits, 11 out of 24 seem to have experienced reactive ethnicity based on these developments. The starting moment is different for everyone. It could be for older people, it could be starting with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. For younger ones, it could be in the last 2 years, or maybe since the Charter of Values. And so that means there's been an increase for those people in their identity as Muslims, group solidarity with Muslims, and political mobilization. And we found 2 processes that might lead to reactive ethnicity. One of them is by those people who are directly affected by said laws or proposals. One example is Hafsa, 24 years old. She was born in Montreal, and she wears the niqab, and she wasn't politicized or actively engaged before, but she became so. And for those indirectly affected, and Nadia wears no religious sign and no visibility as a Muslim, and also not necessarily a racialized person either. And so she got also became more involved based on reactive ethnicity, although she was not directly affected by these proposals. And 4 of these people were politically involved before, but not with the Muslim community, but they became so. Abdul, he defines himself as a hardcore atheist, as I mentioned. And after these events, he realized that, well, I'm being seen and discriminated as Muslim, so I'll just support this cause. And obviously, we should mention that these are relative degrees. There are different degrees of reactive ethnicity. It's not absolute, and it's not expressed evenly. It shows variations for people. So, so Hafsa says, after these debates, I was aware of everything, but I wasn't thinking so much about it, but I understood what it meant. And Nadia says, I want Quebecers to know that you can have a woman that looked like a Quebecer, like her, and join this movement, because I want people to associate me with Islam as well. And Abdul, the strong atheist, and he says, I was somehow born again Muslim in Quebec. I understood that people saw me as Muslim. You're from Tunisia, your name is Abdul, so you're a Muslim, that's it. So that's the first group. The second group is 7 out of 24. That was what we've observed diminished ethnicity for that group. So, you know the definition by now: reduced self-identification, group solidarity, and mobilization. And we've also discovered 2 processes leading to it. One is people who are embracing secularism at an ideological or doctrinal level to distance themselves from activist Muslims. And there are also people who don't change their convictions, but only change their behavior, reducing the visibility of their religions or using nicknames instead of their Muslim-sounding names, and so on. But of course, this is also not an absolute process. So to give you an example, Kareem feels that Muslim activists are going too far. I'm a bit troubled by them because they're taking too strong positions. They should integrate in Quebec, basically. So Lulwa also agrees with that. Quebec wants to avoid religious problems, so practice your religion at home. Why are you wearing religious signs? Ola, on the other hand, is the person who removed her hijab because she faced serious and like on the street and public spaces cases of discrimination and harassment. And she said, I don't want my kids to be raised in a place where they feel they're not accepted. I left Egypt to have a better environment for them, so why should I put them here? So something we didn't expect but did find was cases of no change, basically not as if nothing happened in those 5-10 years. 6 out of 24 was 24 were in that category. In one case, Sama already had a high involvement, so that but the other 5 showed no noticeable change. And they didn't know, and we were kind of surprised in the interviews as well, they didn't know about the bills, about the political parties that confused the federal and provincial level of politics or politicians, generally low political interest or involvement. So this group showed us that minorities' reaction to political conflict cannot be automatically assumed. And one of the reasons for that, as I'm going to mention in the conclusions, the social movements literature, from the social movements literature point of view, these people and the diminished minority people, diminished ethnicity people, are invisible. They're under the radar because social movements focus on social movements that are actually happening. So by definition, these people are not taken into consideration. And some examples: Heidi, politics don't interest me. And Sofia, about Quebec politics, boring. Also, although she wears the hijab and potentially her life chances and future career might be impacted by the religious sign that she's wearing. So I just want to conclude with some of the implications of our findings. So what we've seen in this research is that meaning making is not straightforward at all. People who perceive discrimination might go different places. They might remain completely unchanged, They might react it to hang on more to their religious, ethnic backgrounds, or hide them with the fear that there might be social repercussions, or just by ideological commitment. And social movement research, as I mentioned, talks about reactive ethnicity because that's what they're researching and that's what they find. But alternative responses not leading to mobilization are not studied, and this is exactly where we try to come in. We highlight diminished and unaltered ethnicities, which may occur with or without change in convictions. It's a change in behavior, but not necessarily a change in conviction. For populism research, this shows us that those populations that are the target of legislations, and I want to make the distinction here clear, the legislations may not openly target those populations, but it does create an environment to have those other people targeting the certain populations, especially Muslims. But their reaction cannot be assumed, as I mentioned. And here we're taking the first step to making better sense of individual level processes of managing identities related to ethnicity and ethno-religious identity. And obviously this is not the last word to be said on this, but we're hoping that this would be a contribution to the literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Efe. I guess it is my turn. Well, I came out of a departmental meeting with my dear political science colleagues, and I have to say, it feels good to be among sociologists for the last 2 hours of the week. So I'm going to try to be short so that we have some time for a Q&A, but I understand that you know, it's getting late. So we have two categories of papers here, I think. You may have realized it. On the one hand, Elke, Anke, Verena, and Jan Efe's papers are really more about, I would say, the integration of immigrants or to some extent religious diversity than they are about populism. And then there's Chad's paper. So I'll discuss these two papers first and then Chad's paper. I like the main ideas a lot, especially since they are backed by empirical data. So they're not just ideas, they're actually quite compelling. And in general, the idea, I think, is that if we look at the comparison between Heidelberg and Ottawa, you know, the local level mitigates populism, which is a very, I think, original argument. And if we look at Jan and Efe's paper, the idea that the Muslim community, as it is usually referred to, is not homogeneous, that there are many different views among that community. But if we look at these two papers in the context of the workshop, it raises the question of the link between populism and immigration. If we follow Jan Werner Müller's definition, which is probably the golden standard in political science at least, there is a plausible link between populism and immigration, because populism insists on the unity, on the purity of the people, and that's a definition in which immigrants may not fit. And it's true that empirically many populists are anti-immigrant, Donald Trump, Le Pen, Alternative für Deutschland. But it's also because populism is prevalent for many reasons on the extreme right, which was anti-immigration from the outset. So the connection is not always necessarily that clear between the two, especially since we know there's also left-wing populism, which is not anti-immigration at all. I mean, if you look at Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France or Syriza in Greece, movements that in many ways fit the populist definition, they are usually quite open to immigration. So my main question to you, and I understand that's not so important for the paper itself or for the argument that you're making, but in the context of the workshop, whether populism is really at play here. In Elke, Anke, Verena's paper, we have at the end of the day a fairly traditional contrast between Canada's multiculturalism and Germany's, I'm going to use the word Leitkultur, confounded maybe by the fact you didn't insist on that too much, but I think you have that in mind, of course, that the numbers, if you look at refugees between Canada and Germany, were just not comparable. I mean, that's something that's often missing in the Canadian discussion, where people like to criticize Germany. I mean, the numbers are just incommensurable. So it's, I think that has to be taken into account also when you analyze the reaction on the ground and the kind of adaptation that people had to go through. And in Jan and Efe's paper, it's a debate about laïcité, which in my view, and I'm not an expert neither on Quebec politics nor on secularism, but in my view, it does not overlap so well with populism, at least in the case of Quebec, but I would say also in the case of France. While there are certainly many people we would define as populists who have used laïcité to stigmatize Muslims, for example, there are plenty of proponents of secularism in Quebec and France who are old-fashioned liberal, social democrats, progressives. And that's a real question, because it's often from the outside, I think, framed as a sort of anti-immigration equals populism equals laïcité, but I think it's more complicated than that. There's actually data that shows, from political scientists, that shows that if you look at French speakers who support laïcité in Quebec, you have about as many people who would define themselves as progressives as people who would define themselves as conservatives, which I think is also interesting. And as you show in your paper, Muslims are themselves divided. So the main question for you is, the link with populism, but I have two little small questions for each of you. For Elke, Anke, Verena, my question is methodological. You use the mainstream press to study claims, and that's completely standard, that's fine. But I wonder if there's something missing, especially in this day and age, because when Koopman was doing his work, that was 15 years ago, and now there is something called Facebook and Twitter and the dark web and all that. And I wonder if there's a bias, because especially in the Canadian case, if you don't know Canadian newspapers, they are extremely tame in general. I mean, we have, even the tabloids are kind of, very decent. I'm not sure that captures everything that goes on in people's discussions, which today, I mean, is not in Le Droit or the Ottawa Citizen. So how do we capture this? If we want to understand exactly what's going on the ground, that would be my question for you. And for Jan and Efe, as a paper, I mean, what I like really a lot is the relational also dimension of your analysis. But I'm wondering if it is true, and I think it is, that the attitude of the people you interviewed is relational and interactive. There should also be a life cycle effect. I was struck by the little quotes that you gave us. There is clearly a big age difference. I mean, that may not be representative of anything, but I wouldn't be surprised. And in my personal experience, not scientific at all, but as a teacher, I have had many students who, between the age of 19 and 23, changed considerably their views on the topic of laïcité in one direction and in the other direction. So I'm wondering to what extent that also plays a role in the reactions that you're observing. That would be interesting to follow. Now, I'm going to turn now to Chad's paper about populism. It's a bit unfair because I read that paper in full. And also, Chad and I have a common passion for field theory, which I will spare you from, so I will not talk about that, but I could spend hours on it. So the paper touches upon something that I'm not working on, but I'm been struggling with, which is the collapse of social democracy. And there, again, I think there is a link with populism. Not so much the collapse of social democracy as a program, because it is quite striking then that even when populists come to power, they tend not to touch most of the social benefits, the acquis that social democracy has left behind. The social democracy has been destroyed, or maybe that's going a bit too far. It's been damaged as a political force, but not so much, one could argue, as a program. So the question, that I think Wisconsin is really interesting to look at is, why did that happen, and how is that connected to the rise of populism? And basically, we've moved in Wisconsin, I would argue, as in many other places, from at least that's what my political science colleagues tell me, from a bipolar left-wing system to tripolarization, in which there's a third force that basically is making everything very complicated. And what you show, I think, extremely well in your paper is this, what you call the top-bottom political alliance between the top people and the people at the bottom. And I think you're right that Wisconsin is a very interesting laboratory. So that I completely take. And I also like the idea of looking at symbolic work as a kind of glue that brings together these two classes. Where I do have maybe two quick questions is, first, you ask yourself, what's the structural basis of that symbolic work? You feel you need the structural basis and you don't seem to be able to find it, or at least you're struggling with it. I like the idea of closure as a kind of basis for the politics of resentment, but at the same time, I'm not sure you need to have a structural basis for the alliance. It seems to me that many of these populist parties, what they've done is adding groups rather than finding a coalition. And it's not quite the same thing. That is, speaking to different groups as if they were separate, not creating an alliance of the sort that maybe social democracy had been able to do with, let's say, urban intellectuals and farmers and workers. If you look at the Democratic Party in the US before the 60s, I'm not sure there was a really structural alliance between white racists in the South and progressive workers in the North. There were just two different constituencies that the Democratic Party was able to speak to in parallel. If we look at Canada, for example, the Conservative Party in the 80s managed to get simultaneously the votes from the most conservative Westerners in Alberta and the most progressive French Canadians in Quebec. And these people hated each other, but still they voted for the same party and they managed to even run the country together. So maybe you don't need it. But again, I think the relational and contingent approach that you want to bring from Bourdieu and that other papers are also using is the right way to go, because it allows you to see that every context is different and there's an interaction going on. My last question, and then I'll stop, is so one thing that I love about Pierre Bourdieu, that's why I consider myself almost a card-carrying Bourdieusian, is the sort of syncretic, synthetical approach to social theory. But one thing that's really sometimes annoying with it is that it's not difficult for someone who does not like Bourdieu as much as we do to say, well, I could make the same argument without all the bloody concepts. I mean, it's too complicated. If you strip the analysis from all the Bourdieu's and vocabulary, what do you have? And here my question is, Piketty, or, Piketty has been arguing and showing that, we're facing a situation where you have the Brahmin, what he calls the Brahmin left on the one side and the commercial right on the other. Sounds a lot like the story that you're telling. And he says there's social nativism that's emerging. In political science, I mentioned it, there's this big debate which you referred to between the cultural approach and the economic/inequality approach, and in general, that's how people are trying to make sense of the rise of populism. So my question is, what does Bourdieu add to that debate that's already quite rich in the literature? My answer is also positive, but I want to put it to you. So I will not let you answer my questions because I think that maybe the public also has questions of their own, and we don't have a lot of time. So if you agree with it, you can give sort of more general reactions at the end. So I'll ask the public if they have questions by raising their hand on their blue hand, ideally, on the list of participants. Si vous avez une question en français aussi, ce n'est pas un problème. Je vois Olivier Audet. Vous avez une question? Allez-y.
I'll ask in English. I had a question for Verena, Anke, and Elke about the, I think Ottawa is a rather specific choice for a city in Canada. It has a particular culture of bilingualism, which is different from the bilingualism in Montreal, and the relative lack of bilingualism elsewhere. Doesn't that affect the nature of the comparison? And also, there is such a thing as local news, as widely read local newspapers in Ottawa, but there is not necessarily such a thing in Montreal, where most of the newspapers are really, Montreal's newspapers are actually national newspapers, or actually, you know, provincial newspapers pretty much. Is there, you know, I think those different things kind of have an impact on what you've seen. And if you were to try doing a similar thing in Montreal, you might have some similar results, but I wonder what you think about that.
Merci. Maybe I'll take one more question and then everybody, or two, and then give everybody the chance to react. Frédéric, Guillaume, est-ce que le pouce levé, c'est une question, ça? OK, donc vas-y.
J'ai aucune idée comment faire la main bleue, alors c'est ça. Une petite question pour F et notre collègue de McGill. Dans quelle langue étaient conduites les entrevues? Et est-ce que ça a eu un effet? Est-ce que vous pensez que ça peut avoir un effet aussi sur les résultats que vous avez obtenus?
Merci. OK. Je ne vois pas d'autres mains. I see no other hands. So, maybe we can start with Elke, Verena, and Anke. Any reactions?
Okay, do I start? It's hard to coordinate online if you have 3 people on a paper, but since I eclipsed myself from presenting, I'm just going to try to take this one. Your first one is good. What's the relation with populism? I mean, obviously, yes. When we started this, it wasn't planned, but what we really noticed is that how the local level avoids the polarization, and so maybe what I find particularly, and I think there's reactions or relations to the work with the other 2 presenters. I mean, I think what we do feel that at what populism does, and this goes back to what I presented yesterday, and what we see in the more kind of meta narratives and at the national level is really it's the kind of empathy wars, right? We are very often, and that was populism, and Donald Trump has been so good at, is kind of getting at the emotions, and I think that was what Captain Karma also described as, you know, this politics of resentment. So we're really out of the realm of arguments, but we are in the realm of emotions. And big kind of ideas, abstracts. And I think what we found kind of healthy and encouraging is that at the local level, it's really the pragmatics. And so in that sense, I think the kind of welcome culture in Germany that took place on the ground really avoided that. Now we do agree, and then I come to the other question, maybe Olivier's at the end, that maybe some of the answers what we got was context specific, but however, we also see this is the link to Eva's and Jan's paper is obviously when we looked at reasonable accommodation in Quebec, we had a similar kind of thing going on, right? I mean, it was okay to accommodate as long as it was once done between 2 actors and it was fairly kind of low key, but it was not okay once it hit the media. Then it became, you know, la crise des accommodements raisonnables, and it was not okay at all. And I think this is ties into Frédéric's second question. Once it hit social media, and you know, there you have even more than in the mainstream media, the kind of total polarization. So yes, we agree. You're absolutely right. We didn't study this in the work in this project. What we've done in another project, we looked at the comments that were given to the mainstream press. That was already kind of crazy enough. However, I do admit that I also looking at social media and sometimes looking at these comments also gets me to the limits of my sociological skills, because how do you make sense out of nonsense? So probably there's another kind of a way how to study this. So yes, point taken, and also with Marie's point on one last thing, but this is definitely something that we should take into consideration. I'm trying to go quick. Olivier, yes, this was a particular context. Maybe Anke has. We didn't focus on, since we looked at the national comparison, we didn't focus so much on the linguistic le devoir and the Ottawa citizen. Anke, I don't know whether you recall the differences in that we found. It wasn't something that struck us as totally. I think what the devoir, le droit does is actually you have a fairly kind of Ottawa-centric discourse. You don't get into you have a little bit of Quebec politics, but it's really much more central Canada capital politics. So yes, I would strongly think that we would get a different result. As Verena mentioned at the very beginning, it would be really interesting to look at, let's say, Quebec, maybe Quebec City or maybe Montreal and Dresden, to do a different local context, which we haven't done yet. I stop here.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that, but we didn't actually, for this paper, we didn't actually look at the differences yet between the Anglophone and Francophone press, because we were more focusing on the comparison between the German region and the Canadian, the region around Heidelberg and then the national capital region. But it is something that has come up consistently in at presentations we've done. So it is definitely a factor that would be super interesting to explore in a future paper, because we already have the data there. So we just need to actually do that and look at that. And I think we have plans to also potentially do a comparison between Quebec and another region in Germany that might have been more hit by right-wing movements. So that is hopefully in the works.
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you very much, Frédéric, for your questions. These are great questions, and I will spend a lot of time thinking about them after our discussion today. Just brief, kind of preliminary and brief response now. You asked the question whether the argument really needs this element of a structural basis, what I can do without it. And I think this is a terrific question, because behind this question is the question: what kind of a coalition or alliance are we really talking about here? What is the glue that holds it together? And your example of the Democrats in the 20th century is a great example. I think somewhere Ira Katz-Nelson says that in the 30s, the Democratic Party was like a marriage of social democratic Sweden and racist South Africa. So, and that's a good description. And so it's a very different kind of holding together. The reason I was searching for a different structural basis is because I had the idea that without a structural basis, this kind of top-bottom coalition would be unstable and wouldn't endure for a decade or more, and so that's the sort of presumption. But again, I have to think about the presumption, whether that's actually in fact really true. You asked about whether we can make this argument without all of the conceptual vocabulary from Bourdieu, and in some ways I think so. There are 3 points that I take from Bourdieu. One is about the multidimensional nature of social stratification. That, of course, can be taken from Weber, from Karl Mannheim, from others. The other question, or the other point that I take from Bourdieu, is about the nature of the alliance between intellectuals and the dominated classes. there, I think Bourdieu maybe does provide a very distinctive kind of explanation for that earlier classical kind of alliance, which you don't easily find elsewhere. But it's the third point that I think maybe Bourdieu is most useful for, which is thinking about, and this is, of course, a controversial aspect of Bourdieu's work, thinking about to what extent fields can be structured in such a way that actors develop an interest in the universal. And again, this is something really different. So Alvin Gouldner talked about the new class as a flawed universal class, right? But Bourdieu's position, I think, is different. That there are no universal classes. There are only I think that's the end of my comments. I hear the closing credits. But this is mostly what I wanted to say. And I also want today really interesting. Even though mine is a case study, I'm a firm believer in interdisciplinary and comparative social research. And so hearing about these other cases and listening to colleagues from a variety of disciplinary perspectives was really enlightening for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Efe, you get the last word.
Actually, I was hoping to pass the last word to Jan.
Okay.
For the question.
While you're multitasking on something else?
No. Just for the questions of whether English and French made a difference. And also there was a question that you raised, Frédéric, which was about the generational differences, if any.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Frédéric, and thank you also, Guillaume, for those questions. I think Effie will answer Frédéric's question about the relationship of the project to populism, which is indeed a good one. It's a very astute observation that there is a relationship to age there, and I would add to generation as well. So second generation immigrants have a very different relationship to a polity, much more expansive demands in terms of what incorporation means and what rights should be guaranteed. First generation immigrants tend to be happy that they can work, that they're not accosted, that they're safe. Of course, there are people who become political activists from the first generation, but the demands are often much more tempered than those that second generation immigrants make. So that is very true, Frédéric. The people who react with reactive ethnicity tend to be younger. Not all of them. So there are people who were apolitical and people who are older and become politicized as a response to experiencing secularist legislation, but most of them are not. Most of the people are indeed younger. And I'm actually writing another paper that is coming out of this project where I write about this path-setting effect that occurs when people at a relatively young age, where they form their political opinions and their political identities, experience discrimination and are then, of course, to a certain extent locked in. They expect to find more discrimination as more elections occur, as they watch politics, as they apply for jobs and so on. And of course, then they will also perceive more, right? Which could be an effect of simply having fewer false negatives, right? So they see more of the discrimination that is actually occurring, or they become biased to a certain extent. And I think both of these responses would be plausible. So that's a very important aspect of this all, for sure. It is a durable effect that gets locked in to some extent. And then Guillaume asked about the language of interviews. We let the respondents choose the language of the interviews as appropriate for Montreal. That often meant code switching. So we would go back and forth between French and English as respondents liked. We also did conduct interviews that were entirely in French. And actually, something that I would mark here as interesting is that I did actually not see a difference in people's perspective that aligned with their language. The only thing I can say is that people who felt that they were not being discriminated against at all were often not fluent in French, which in part can explain that they just didn't really consume Francophone media very much. And in that sense, for example, had no access to the Journal de Montréal, for example, where you would see these arguments for secularism made in a more forceful way and sometimes in a slightly more polemic way. And so they were to some extent shielded from that discourse. But the effect was not as big as I thought. Thank you for those questions. I'll let Efe take this last part here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jan. So the relationship with populism, I think that question can be answered in a couple of ways. One of them is related to our discussions this morning and also yesterday, when Olivia, I think, used the term populisme diète, or light populism for the case of Le CAC. And the other one is something that Emily had mentioned, which is about seeing populism not only as a zero-sum game, but also certain strategies and tools that can be incorporated by seemingly mainstream parties. So with the question of La Coalition Avenir Québec, we can maybe see this as a certain degree of populism or being influenced by populism, as far as it defines the people directly or indirectly as the Catholic white majority, or seeing that as the main constituency, and also thinking of contributing to the process of perhaps marginalizing certain other communities that do not fit in this description. But as you mentioned, Frédéric, it would be naive to claim that these kind of policies are coming only from right-wing groups, or it does not necessarily mean that they may be coming from people who self-identify as progressive. And if you go back to the 1989 quote from the Le Nouvel Observateur that I shared, all the people over there, they are Elisabeth Badinter and some others, that they are all identifying as progressive. But I think another link to populism could be that in this particular study, the effects, the actual effects of those discussions on the people involved that we interviewed, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. If in the subway, they somebody approaches them and says that go back to your own country and so on, that is experienced as the effect of sort of a nativist politics. Although not everyone who's endorsing those those policies are nativist or right wing. So that would be the two connections that I can make with populism.
Thank you very much. Merci. I'm turning to the organizers. Am I responsible for closing the session and thanking everyone? No, someone will. Well, I on my behalf, I want to thank all the presenters for extremely interesting papers. You made my day, literally, and so I think there's lots that will come out of these projects, but the beginning is already quite compelling. So thank you very much. Merci.
You did a very great job too. I'll say a closing word first in English and then in French. We've been talking about populism for 16 hours now, approximately in 2 days. I think it was, from the organizer's point of view, a very fascinating 16 hours. We decided to do this workshop in 2 languages, in French and English. And I think maybe for the people outside Canada, it was a little bit weird, but for us, it gave us the possibility to bring together people who usually don't talk together. And this was something very interesting for us as intellectuals who work here, who are always either only with French-speaking person or only with English-speaking person. And this is one of the very rare occasion we have to really engage in a cross-academic dialogue. And I think it was very, very interesting for us. A lot of multidisciplinary presentation also. That was also a very fascinating point of the program of these 16 hours. And I would really like to thank everybody for your participation in this And maybe as a result of the American election, and we all, I guess, feel a little bit more relief, I would stress that I found the participants very, very listening to each other and very engaging with each other and very respectful. And that was also something that maybe could have been different at the result of the last election, been a little bit different. So it also raised interesting question about the future of the study of populism. Alors, en français, pour terminer, j'aimerais vraiment remercier l'ensemble des participants, des participantes à ce colloque. Je pense qu'on a eu 16 heures d'études du populisme qui étaient extrêmement enrichissantes. On a vu des gens à différents niveaux dans leur carrière, dans leur trajectoire, dans leur réflexion sur le populisme. Et je pense que les engagements, les discussions étaient extrêmement enrichissantes et vont pouvoir permettre de poursuivre des projets de recherche extrêmement intéressants sur ces enjeux. Comme je l'ai dit en anglais, je pense que l'aspect bilingue du colloque a aussi permis d'amener des gens à discuter ensemble qui souvent sont dans des vases clos et ne peuvent pas le faire. Je pense que ça a été vraiment un des aspects extrêmement intéressants de ce colloque. Et enfin, j'aimerais terminer en remerciant beaucoup Peker pour un professionnalisme extraordinaire tout au long de ce colloque. Des capacités organisationnelles hors du commun de mon point de vue. Un énorme merci à Jamila Bonnes aussi qui a assuré un roulement extraordinaire du colloque, un suivi avec tout le monde. Ça a été vraiment extrêmement agréable de travailler avec vous tous. Merci encore à tout le monde.
Merci à toi, Guillaume, et Jamila, et tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup.
C'était un grand plaisir.
Alors, je déclare ce colloque terminé.
Merci beaucoup.
Bye, Elke, c'était le fun de te revoir.
Oui, également.